It seems like we're seeing something significant happening globally, doesn't it? A kind of counter reaction where Democratic allies are pushing back against these far-right ideologies that's sort of often labeled Trumpism.
Yeah, it's definitely a noticeable trend, and recent elections, they really offer some clear examples of this shift.
What's really striking, I think, is how decisive some of these rejections have been.
Absolutely. Look at Canada and Australia. You had incumbent left-leaning parties winning against conservative candidates. And these weren't just any candidates, they were often leading in the polls, sometimes using that far-right playbook.
And they still lost. Even more, the actual conservative leaders lost their own seats in parliament in both cases. That's pretty telling.
It really is. Canada's a great example to unpack. After a decade of liberal leadership, everyone sort of expected the conservatives might finally win.
Right. It fit that pattern we saw globally. Incumbents having a tough time after the pandemic.
Exactly. But the sources we looked at suggest Donald Trump's, let's say, antagonistic relationship with Canada, even mentioning annexation in the past. That really seemed to sour voters on a Canadian version of that far-right approach.
So that direct link, a foreign leader's actions impacting a domestic vote, that's quite something.
It is. And the Liberals, they jumped on it. They positioned themselves as the ones who'd stand up to that kind of, well, potential aggression.
And it worked. Their win suggests Canadians looked at the 2025 Trump model and basically said, no thanks. They saw it as a failure for their interests.
Precisely. And then you look at Australia, and it's, well, a very similar dynamic, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it seems like Australian voters also watched what was happening with Trump, the rhetoric, the events, and drew a line to their own Conservative Party's platform.
And again, they rejected that model. They
Yeah.
opted for the candidate, the party that was clearly opposing it. It feels like a very conscious choice based on observing the U.S.
It really underscores something important, doesn't it? That while maybe some populist ideas resonate here and there, the specific history and the geopolitical situation of a country really shapes how things play out politically.
Couldn't agree more. In both Canada and Australia, it seems like the negative perception of the Trump administration was a powerful, maybe even decisive factor for voters thinking about going in a similar direction domestically.
Okay, so let's switch gears slightly to Germany. The situation with the far-right AfD party, that offers a slightly different perspective.
Right. Their recent election results were, well, below what some expected, even with endorsements from figures like Elon Musk and J.D. Vance.
Yeah, those endorsements were interesting in themselves. But the really big development recently is German intelligence designating the AfD an official far-right extremist organization.
That's huge, especially in Germany, given its history. It's not just a label. It comes with real powers, like surveillance.
And it speaks volumes about Germany's sensitivity to right-wing extremism, how seriously they take protecting their constitutional order.
It absolutely does. But, of course, it hasn't gone without criticism, particularly from some on the American right, figures like J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio.
Exactly. Vance claimed the AfD was the most popular party, which, well, polling data just doesn't support.
Yeah.
They're around 25% nationally, maybe 35% in the East, but certainly not the most popular.
Right, a significant misrepresentation. And Rubio called this surveillance tyranny in disguise, framing it purely as being about immigration policy disagreements.
Which kind of misses the point that German authorities are making about extremism and constitutional threats, doesn't it? It shows a real difference in how the far right is viewed and handled in the U.S. versus Germany.
It really does. The German Foreign Office pushed back strongly, emphasizing their duty to protect the Constitution, learn from history,
And it seems the German public largely agrees. Polls show, 61% support the extremist designation, and almost half would even support a ban.
Yeah, that shows a pretty strong domestic consensus there, which makes the open support from some American political figures for a party deemed extremist by its own government.
Well, it's notable.
Especially given Germany's history, like you said. It does raise some serious questions about maybe a disconnect in values or understanding across these allied nations.
It certainly highlights a divergence in how different democracies are tackling the rise of far-right movements. Germany's decisive action versus the sympathetic view from some corners in the U.S., it's a stark contrast.
So if we pull back and look at Canada, Australia, Germany, you start to see this pattern, right? Key Democratic allies seem to be actively stepping away from the kind of far-right political trends that have gained ground in the U.S.
Yes, it feels like they're putting their own sovereignty, their own historical context first when making these political choices.
And that trend, that rejection among allies, it stands in pretty sharp contrast to what's happening inside the United States itself, where the far right has gained considerable influence, pushing an agenda that some sources describe as actively trying to dismantle, established constitutional norms, the rule of law, even the government safety net.
The analysis we reviewed goes further, suggesting this U.S. direction is actually eroding global trust. Things like threatening other sovereign nations, the tariffs.
Yeah, actions seen as making the world less stable. The U.S. president is portrayed in some of these analyses as, well, maybe unbalanced, driven by grievances, and not quite grasping the international system America itself helped build.
It's a fascinating divergence. The U.S. heading one way, its traditional allies seemingly choosing another.
And that has potentially massive long-term implications, doesn't it? For alliances, for trade, for the whole global order. This rejection of the Trumpism model by key partners could really reshape things.
It almost feels like a significant part of the global community is watching the American political experiment with the far right and consciously saying, we're going a different way, back towards maybe more established democratic norms and cooperation.
hmm The big question now, I suppose, is whether this clear divergence, this gap between the U.S. political direction and the choices of its closest allies, will eventually circle back and have any influence on the political conversation within the United States.
Yeah.
That gap could become a really critical factor going forward.
Definitely something to keep watching. That's all for today's Dissent Picks. If you believe in standing up for what's right, please check out our collections at dissentpicks.com, featuring thought-provoking t-shirts, mugs, stickers, and more that amplify your voice. Stay informed, stand strong, and we'll see you next time.